I've had my 2020 Specialized Turbo Levo comp now for just over a week and already have over 70 miles on it. In my last video, I gave my impressions and suggested what could be improved. Now that I have more experience and made some changes, I wanted to show you what I have learned so far. The first mod that I did was remove the dork disc. These are used in case the gears are adjusted incorrectly, but I recommend just adjusting the gears correctly. The easy way to get it out is to just cut it with a pair of scissors. Next, I rerouted the front brake tubing. It was on the outside of the fork from the dealer, but I moved it to the inside to make it more crash resistant. I then cut the handlebars to 730 millimeters. I believe in the push-up test to set the width. Just do a push-up on a yardstick and see the width of the outside of your hands, and that's the position that you naturally have the most leverage in. I then added a RAM phone mount. I've tried so many mounts, and this is the only one that I've been happy with the security of it. I don't use my good iPhone on it, and instead I got a cheap Android phone so that I don't have to worry about it breaking or crashing. And I use this as my bike computer with a moving map using the Levo app. You can get new Android phones for as low as $55. I then added this bell. When I'm riding up on dog walkers, I prefer to ring it rather than calling out. Then I got this Shimano tool holder that fits into a water bottle cage. I only use water on rides that are over about 2 hours long, and if I want drinks, I keep them in a backpack. Then I put on this 36-tooth chainring. I did this because with the 32-tooth, if I'm going 20 miles per hour, I have to pedal at about 100 RPM, which is hard to do. With the 36-tooth, I drop down to about 80 RPM, and then I can push hard and go faster than the 20. It only cost about $19 for the ring and bolts. So what's the downside? Well, in theory, you lose some climbing capability, but I've never actually used this largest sprocket in the back. So between there being plenty of large sprockets and the motor power, it's really a non-issue. You do notice the motor cutting off at 20 miles per hour more than you did before, because when you're pedaling at about 80 RPM, it's more noticeable than at 100 RPM. So, consider something like a Planet 3 to bypass the speed limiter if you want to not feel that annoying cutoff. So this chainring guide, it normally doesn't work with a 36 tooth unless you flip it vertical, but that looks really odd. So I custom designed an alternate chainring part. It's this back piece. And I've been starting to manufacture them. So if you'd like to order one, see the link below the video. Now for handling. These bikes have flip chips. If you change it to the high position, the fork becomes 1/2 degree less slack and the steering becomes more responsive. I did that and prefer it because I think that the 66.5 degrees that it changes to is still plenty slack. And in fact, it's a lot more slack than my other bike. You also get about 5 millimeters more ground clearance. I've not had any crank strikes at all with this bike. In my last video, I spoke about my suspension woes. It was unplanted and bouncy, and there wasn't any setting that would allow me to get a normal preload and use the full range. In my last video, I spoke about the suspension woes. It was unplanted and bouncy, and there wasn't any setting that would allow me to get a normal preload but still use the full range. For example, if I set the air pressure such that I could use most of the travel, preload was a ridiculous 30 to 40%. That is bad because it was wasting the beginning of the travel stroke. And if I set the preload to a more normal 20%, then I could not go beyond half of the travel. At the time, I concluded that the bike was overforked and that it was a mistake that they put a lyric on it. Then I saw some people online say that there were volume-reducing tokens already in the suspension. I found this unlikely because the bike came with a box of tokens, and it wouldn't make sense that the shocks were full of tokens and had tokens that wouldn't go in it. But I had to be sure, so I opened up the fork in the rear shock. To my surprise, the fork had 2 already in it, and the rear shock had 3. Now I was really happy though, because that meant that the suspension was fixable. I removed all of the tokens, equalized the air pressure, and set the front and back preload to 20%. I then bounced around and re-equalized the pressure and set them again just to be sure. This resulted in 80 psi up front, and on the back, my shock pump only goes to 150, but I did 150 plus 20 pumps, and that gave me the 20% preload. I'm 64 kilograms in weight. I did another test ride, and yeah, everything was fixed. It felt normal. I was using most of the shock range. So great, my bike is good now, in all ways except for the brakes. As far as the brakes, I'm used to ones with more adjustments. You can set the length of pull on these, but not the dead spot setting. So when you start to pull them, it's quite a while before you hit the braking action. And that I'm not used to because on my Shimano XTR brakes, I have all of that dialed out. My bike came with these Guide RE levers, and I was never happy with them because they have all of this slack. And the more expensive levers have a contact point adjustment. The better levers, it's not like they cost that much more, but they didn't come on the bike. And to change these could be almost $300. So I invented this deslackinator that you snap on to the reach adjustment, and now you have perfect fingertip control with no extra slack. These brakes went from horrible, I hated them compared to my XT brakes, and now they're my favorite brakes without having to replace the levers. Now let's talk about tires. I made them tubeless before riding, and on my first ride, I knew that the Butcher and Eliminator were not very good. Now part of that problem did turn out to be the bouncy suspension, but even after I fixed it, these tires still slipped when I don't think they should have. I replaced them with Maxxis DHR and DHR2 with the new EXO Plus casing that's a little bit thicker and the 2.6 inch width. But note that Maxxis rates the width at max pressure. Nobody would ever ride at that pressure. I run them between 12 and 15 psi up front and 15 and 19 in the back. At those pressures, they're about 2.5 inches wide. And just for comparison, Michelin's tires are called 2.4 inches, and they actually are 2.4 inches at the rideable pressure. So there's really not as much difference in what people think between tires called 2.6 and some that are called 2.4. Now I've been testing each of these changes on a 9-mile trail loop. It's mostly single track with some wider areas. The fastest I did this loop with the specialized tires was 18.0 miles per hour. My average heart rate was 156 beats per minute. My time was 31 minutes and 4 seconds. With the Maxxis, I averaged 18.9 miles an hour. My human power, yes, was 9% more watts, and my heart rate was 9 higher at 165. My time went down to 29:35, so 1 minute and 29 seconds faster. So was I faster because I pushed harder? Well, yes, but I was able to keep stomping on the pedals more often because I felt more planted on the ground. The tires felt noticeably more grippy, and any sliding on loose sand was very predictable. So spending $145 on these tires was really the cheapest way to make a big improvement in capability of the entire bike. So there you have it. I love everything about the bike now. And if anyone tells you that you can't get exercise on an e-mountain bike, my 174 beat per minute max heart rate disagrees.